So what is Vipassana or insight meditation, and how does it differ from other kinds of meditation like the ones that we use to calm ourselves? That's what we'll be dealing with in today's video. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So a while back, Afanasy Bushwanov asked an interesting question, which was basically, what is Vipassana or insight meditation, and how does it differ from samatha meditation or calming meditation? Because it's not entirely clear in the first place, what Vipassana means, what it is, what kind of meditation it is, and how it differs. And to answer this question, it may help remembering a book that I mentioned in a prior video, which is called The Birth of Insight. And it's a book which I recommended, and I'll put a link to down below, about the birth of insight meditation. Because insight meditation as such, something that we call insight or Vipassana meditation, really began in the late 19th, early 20th century in Burma with a particular monk named Ledi Sayadaw. And while Ledi Sayadaw was a traditional monk, he also was a traditional monk who was interested in innovating the Dharma in his time in a post-colonial or a colonial atmosphere in order to sort of respond to the colonialization at the time, which was introducing new religions, in particular Christianity, into Burma. And basically to respond to those innovations, that is to say, to the colonial innovations, he wanted to respond with his own, with understanding the Dharma in a new way, or at least uncovering some old ways that it had been understood in the past that were not current. So at the time, basically the notion that awakening was possible had sort of decayed within Burma, and I believe within much of Southeast Asia. This is one of the points that Eric Braun makes in that book. And so what you have is this notion that attaining awakening was something that was extremely difficult and something that only could be attained over, let's say, multiple lifetimes. And as a result, any particular monastic was not expected to attain awakening or even to attempt to attain awakening. What they were supposed to do was rather more mundane. And that went, of course, doubly, triply, 10 times for lay people. Lay people, it was not even considered that they would be attaining awakening. And my supposition here, although I don't know that it's quite said this way in the book, my supposition would be that in that kind of context where awakening really wasn't thought of as particularly possible, I would imagine that Christian proselytes would have an easier time gaining adherents, because Christianity, in contradistinction, was a religion that was promising a kind of salvation within this very life. That is to say, all you needed to do was to accept certain propositions, believe certain things, assent to certain claims about Jesus, about Christianity, and you were guaranteed heavenly rebirth, or that is to say, you were guaranteed to attain heaven after you died. And in contradistinction to that, at the time, Buddhism, the salvation that Buddhism promised, at least insofar as we consider it a salvation, at least, let's put it this way, for a lay audience and for perhaps a large monastic audience as well, they would have thought of awakening as a kind of salvation, but it was a salvation that was very, very distant. And so I would think that the competition here was pretty strong. So basically, Ledi Sayadaw was trying to figure out, by looking at the ancient texts, by his knowledge of the ancient texts, basically how to make the achievement of awakening within a Buddhist context as efficient as possible. In a way, is there a way to understand awakening such that lay people might even attain to it? And of course, we know that for the vast majority of lay people, they don't have the time to put into very intensive meditation on a daily basis. And for this reason, one of the innovations that Ledi Sayadaw introduced was to leave jhana to one side. Now, jhana is a form of meditation, of deep absorptive meditation, which I've discussed in prior videos, but it takes a number of hours of meditation every day in order to achieve it, at least for the vast majority of people. It's not the sort of thing that on a lay person's kind of a working daily routine they're going to be able to do very easily. So instead of focusing on a deep jhana, which is one part of traditional meditation, what Lady Sayadaw did instead was to focus on what we might term mindfulness meditation in a sort of a broad general sense. That is to say, focusing on the Satipatthana Sutta and the suttas on mindfulness, on focusing on the mindfulness of the body, on the 4 different foundations of mindfulness. And this, at least for many lay people, would have been an easier way to proceed. Because mindfulness meditation is the sort of thing that you can do in short periods of time every day. You can do mindfulness meditation, let's say successfully, insofar as we can understand a success here, with 5 minutes a day, with 2 minutes a day, just sitting down and being aware of the body and the breath and being aware of the state of the mind. We can do it moment to moment. We can do it while we're working. We can do it while we're walking. It's something we can integrate into daily life, whereas jhana we really can't. But in particular, Lady Sayadaw wanted to focus on the mindfulness refrain. Now, the refrain is a certain passage within the sutta on the foundations of mindfulness that repeats throughout the sutta. And basically, it's a refrain which I've discussed in my prior videos on the foundations of mindfulness, that we are to focus on the arising and passing of each of the states that we're supposed to contemplate within a mindfulness context. We're supposed to be aware of the fact that they are impermanent. We're supposed to make ourselves aware of this in a moment-by-moment way, in a direct way, not simply to be aware of their impermanence intellectually, but to become aware of it in a visceral level. And this insight into change, this insight into the impermanence of these states, also allows us to have insight into their unsatisfactory nature, because anything that is impermanent is not itself completely satisfactory, because even insofar as it is satisfactory, it decays and goes away. So it's not something we can rely upon. So to that extent, it's not reliable. Also, we're to become aware in the same way that these states are non-self, that they're not ourselves, they're not who we are, because they arise and pass. Whoever we are, whoever we would like to be, is something that we think of as being permanent, as something that sort of persists. But these states we can see we can see directly arise and pass, so they cannot be who we are. And these 3 aspects, the aspects into insight into the 3 aspects of reality, that reality is changeable, that reality is in some sense unsatisfactory, and that reality is non-self, these 3 aspects, this is what we're to have insight into. So when we call that meditation insight meditation, or Vipassana, which is the Pali word for insight, or translated as insight, what we're saying is that this is a meditation that involves insight into these 3 aspects of reality. And Lady Sayadaw thought of this kind of meditation, this form of meditation, as most efficient, because within the early texts, awakening is attained upon the sort of understanding that is not a conceptual understanding, but a visceral understanding of these 3 aspects of reality. It's insight into the non-self nature of reality, insight into dukkha, which is the second of these, the fact that reality is not satisfactory, insight into change, that then produces awakening, because as we're aware of reality in this sense, we tend to disidentify with it, we tend to relax around it, we tend not to cling to it. It's also worth saying that although Lady Sayadaw himself was innovating in the sense that he was leaving jhana largely to one side and focusing on lay practice, that is to say, he was teaching to lay people, he was teaching in the vernacular language, which was unusual in that day. It's not as though this was not done in the early suttas. He was intimately aware of the suttas in the Pali Canon, which was his background. And in fact, we do find in the Pali Canon remarks that awakening is possible, or seems to be possible, without the achievement of at least all of the jhanas. It's not entirely clear, but it's not clear that it's clear that one can achieve awakening without achieving complete mastery of the jhanas, because there are people who do it in the early texts. It's also clear in the early texts that the Buddha was not opposed to lay people attaining awakening, or at least trying to attain awakening. There was nothing, he was not opposed to that in any way. So, and certainly lay people did reach high levels of achievement. So It's when we say that Lady Sayadaw was introducing innovations, he was introducing them as innovations in his day and in the Buddhist religion of his day. But if we look at the Buddhist history, what he was trying to do, at least in his lights, and I think correctly, was to sort of unearth earlier practices which could be more useful in a modern context. So in any event, and this, his attempt is to produce in us a mind of non-clinging by insight into these aspects of reality. And by doing that, he's trying to produce the third noble truth, or make us aware of the third noble truth, that that awakening is possible through the decay or extinction of clinging. Now, Afanasy Bushmanov's question that I referred to at the beginning of the video was how, not only what is insight or what is Vipassana meditation, but how does it differ from calming meditation? In the first hand, they're not entirely different, and I think it would be a mistake to think of insight as sort of versus calm, or insight as different, because we need some level of calm, some level of relaxation in order to pursue this kind of, or any kind of meditation, really. That's one of the reasons why focusing on the breath is so important in all kinds of Buddhist meditation, really, because by focusing on the breath, we at least begin to calm down the body. And when we begin to calm down the body, we're able to focus in more intently on whatever it is we're trying to do. So, for example, it certainly does help to begin with breathing meditation if we're going to achieve jhana, but that takes much longer. That's a much more deep, focused kind of enterprise, but it is also a kind of calming meditation. If we're going to do normal mindfulness meditation, where we're just focusing on the different aspects of the mind or the body, that also tends to begin with calming. Because if we're not calm, if the mind is bouncing around too much, we're not able to focus well enough on what the body or the mind is producing for us. All we can do is focus on the blooming, buzzing confusion, which is enough for us. If that's what the mind is producing, then at least we're aware of that. But it's still, we can achieve much more if we're able to calm. So to that extent, there isn't really a hard and fast distinction between calming meditation and Vipassana. They're related. You have to do both. You have to do calming if you're going to do Vipassana. But I think what distinguishes Vipassana meditation from simply calming meditation is that, of course, we can get to a calming meditation where we get to sort of a blissed out state, where we're relaxed and we're calm and we're not stressed, but we're just sort of hanging out there. We're not doing anything. And that isn't really what we're trying to do in traditional Buddhist meditation. What we want to do is then, once we get to that level, to use that calm to a greater end. And in particular in Vipassana, there is I would say, a key cognitive aspect here. Insight into these three aspects of experience is something that is at least partly cognitive. I mean, we have to be aware of the arising and passing. Those are cognitive, those are intellectual, in at least to a degree intellectual states, because we're seeing things, we're naming things in a sense as arising and passing. Even if we don't explicitly use those words in our mind, we're at least fitting them into a kind of a cognitive role. Now that, of course, is not to say that it's merely cognitive, because otherwise, we could do Vipassana meditation simply by picking up a book of Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist theory and reading about it, and that clearly would not be sufficient. So it's more than simply cognitive, but it's at least partly cognitive. And in that way, as we use this cognition to understand the world correctly from within an early Buddhist context, to the extent that we're able to then change our emotional attachment with the world. In other words, we're able to see it as non-self, as non-satisfactory, as changeable, and we're able to relax around it, which is an emotional kind of reaction. Then we're able to achieve, I would say, a more skillful state of relation to the world. So if you're interested in pursuing Vipassana or insight meditation, there are, of course, many, many resources around the web, or there are insight or Vipassana groups within many cities around the world. If you see a Buddhist meditation group in your town or city or a local town that calls itself Vipassana or insight, that's the kind of thing that, at least at some level, they're pursuing. But if you want to pursue this on your own without access to those kinds of groups, one thing to do is to do a kind of mindfulness meditation, but to, try to remember to be aware of the arising and passing of states, to try to be aware of the unsatisfactory nature of these states because of their arising and passing, because of their impermanence, to try to be aware of the selfless nature of states, that these states are not who you are, that they're not you, that they are, to some degree, an objective part of the furniture of the world, and so there's something that you can see yourself as distinct from, and so therefore there's something that you can relax around and let go. So if you're interested in discussing more about this, please leave your comments and questions down below. I'd be really interested to hear your own experience with this kind of meditation if you have it. If you're also interested in diving a little deeper, check out my Patreon page, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.